In this video, we're going to step through a static data set in the slides. So no Tableau, no visualization of any kind, just to get our heads around the notion of level of detail as it pertains to a particular data set, aggregation as a concept and how that is related to level of detail, and then some terminology related to these various pieces. So let's just kind of dive in. So the level of detail, if we're going to define it more rigorously, is the granularity represented by each row. So it really is, what is each row actually representing? So in this case, I've actually just pulled that a small piece of the world indicators data set that we've been using. And in this particular data set, the fundamental meaning of each row is the value or the state or whatever of a country in a particular year. So here I have, for instance, Afghanistan is a country in Asia, and 2000, the GDP in this NAN here means missing value, as I've coded it. In the second row, we have Afghanistan as a region in Asia. In year 2001, its GDP was 2.46, and this is measured in billions, $2.46 billion, and so on and so on and so on. Or maybe it's trillions. Regardless, it's a consistent measurement. So my point is that each row here is an individual country at a particular year. So the level of detail we're operating at is at the country year level of detail. So it's not just country, it's not just year, right? It's the combination of a country and a year. Notice that the region here is kind of not part of the level of detail because each region has multiple countries. So the fact you could take the region out of this data set altogether and you would still have the same level of detail. Each row would still represent a country and a year. So we often use the words coarser or finer, or yeah, that's typically the way we're going to talk about it. So coarser means bigger, more granular, more constituents. Things like a region has, multiple countries. Finer means more individualistic, more broken down, fewer constituents. So a region is a big group, and a region has multiple countries. So region is the coarser level of detail, and countries are the finer level of detail. So this notion of coarseness and fineness is what brings us to the notion of aggregation, because often we want to move through levels of coarseness and level of detail. So for instance, like from the national level of detail to the regional level of detail to the store level of detail, or from the yearly level of detail to the quarterly level of detail to the daily or weekly or whatever, or from product category to product SKU or whatever you have. Moving between these levels of detail along this coarseness fineness scale is kind of the name of the game. So how do we do that thing? So if we want to move levels of detail, in particular if we want to move from finer to coarser, so kind of up the chain, we need to aggregate. And by aggregate we mean combine things together. So let's give an example. So imagine we're moving from country year to year. The first thing we would need to do is group all values in the data set that have the same year. So everything for year 2000, everything for year 2001. Once we have those groups, we need to smush those values down. The technical term for smush is aggregate. So we take all the numbers associated with a particular year and we aggregate them down to a single value and we move on. So typical aggregator functions are for numerical variables are things like sum, average, min, max, median. Any function that takes a collection of values and reduces it down to a single value will work. For categorical variables, a common aggregator is mode, although as we see, Tableau doesn't make this very simple. So we'll talk about that. But let's do an example. So if we're looking at going from the country year level of detail to the year level of detail, the first thing I need to do is aggregate or identify everything that has the year 2000. So these are all the countries going from Afghanistan and Albania all the way down to Yemen and Zambia. And we have gone to, I think I sliced off the bottom, Zimbabwe should be on there. We have all the different GDPs and we sum them together. So this number here is just the sum of all of these numbers here. And that is in the new data frame at the coarser level of detail, all of these rows have disappeared and all I have is one row representing year 2000. And then I would do the same thing for year 2001. I go through the data set, I identify everything with year 2001 from Afghanistan and Albania down to Yemen and Zambia. I sum all of these numbers if that's how I'm aggregating, and that becomes one new row in my coarser data frame, my coarser level of detail. I keep doing the same thing for 2002, and I just keep doing this for all the years, in fact, and now I have a very coarse level of detail. So instead of being at the country year level of detail, I'm just at the year level of detail. This value here, this particular row, represents the total GDP across everything else in the data set. So in this particular case, it's across all countries with a fixed year, 2000, 2001, so on and so on. So let's see, it doesn't matter what we aggregate by or whatever. Let's do it the other way. So imagine we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go for, I'm getting ahead of myself. We could totally use any other aggregator function. So in this case, if we aggregate by mean, for instance, this value here, this 167, is the average GDP across all countries in 2000. So I take the every GDP for the entire world in year 2000, and instead of summing all of those values, I take the average of all of those values. We'll come back to this example later on. But imagine we wanted to go from country year and instead of going to the year level of detail, go to the country level of detail. So it's kind of exactly flipped. So if I want to look at the kind of the total GDP of Afghanistan over the period in question, instead of grouping by year and then aggregating, I now group by country. So I take all the values related to Afghanistan in a particular year and I sum them. So I've isolated Afghanistan. Now year is the thing that's varying, and year is the thing that I'm aggregating out when I take the sum. I'll do the same thing for Albania. I identify all the rows that have a particular country value. That means that they vary across year, and then I aggregate away the GDP values by taking the sum in this case. Same thing for Algeria. I identify all the data points with country Algeria. That means the year varies. I aggregate out the year by taking the sum across GDP, and I get a particular value. And I do this for every single country in the data frame. So, and again, we could use the mean, same exact thing. I want to point out one more example while we're here, which is a little bit strange. We could also do region. So if we wanted to go from the country year level of detail to the region level of detail, we actually are aggregating out two of the fields. So in this case, if, for instance, I'm going to pick Africa, so I'm looking at the aggregate value for Africa, but that means country is changing all the way from Algeria to Zimbabwe, and then year is changing all the way from 2000 to 2011. So I have every country, every year, and I'm adding up all the GDPs. So notice what's happening. It's not like we're just getting rid of one thing or the other thing. We're actually getting rid of two of the dimensions because we're aggregating out country and we're aggregating out year. All we're left with is a single value for each particular region. So I could do the same thing for Asia. I have countries from Afghanistan to Vietnam, and for each country I have years 2000 to 2011. So both of these dimensions are getting aggregated out. And the same thing from Europe. Albania to the UK for my countries, and year 2000 to 2011 for the years. And both of these things are getting aggregated out. And we could continue doing this for all of the regions in the data set, and we could use any aggregator function that we wanted to. So what can actually comprise the level of detail? So we've seen that categorical variables like country and region can totally serve as levels of detail, but also discrete numerical variables like year can serve just as well. We can't aggregate by continuous numerical variables because it just conceptually doesn't make sense. So imagine you tried to aggregate by customer lifetime value. No two customers are going to have exactly the same customer lifetime value, and so it doesn't make sense to aggregate because I can't group like data points together because everyone has a unique value. So these continuous numerical variables just don't make sense. So anytime we're talking about the level of detail of a data set, it's some combination of discrete numerical variables and categorical variables, things like region, year, or country. Now, because we have so many choices, you have to ask yourself, well, how would I pick the level of detail? And that level of detail is entirely dependent on what the question you're asking is. So if we're looking at, well, how are we performing across different product categories, then that's, we need to look at some kind of product category or SKU or subcategory level of detail. If you're asking yourself, well, how are we performing at different times of year? Maybe it's a weekly level of detail that's appropriate. If you're asking yourself, how are we performing in different regions of the country? Maybe a region or sub-region or district level of detail is appropriate. It's entirely driven by the question you're asking. So the point then is that we have to be able to move fluidly between these things as we move from question to question or sub-question to sub-question. Once we've picked the level of detail, though, we have to be really, really careful. It's very easy to pick the wrong level of detail. And in particular, we often have problems in Tableau in particular because the default in Tableau is sum. But that doesn't make sense, as we're going to see. And we even saw an example here. In fact, let me just go back quickly here. I don't think that this makes sense, this number. You know what I mean? The total GDP. Because what does this represent? It represents the total economic output of this region, of the African region in the data set, over all countries and all years. So it's like the total African GDP output across an 11-year period. That's not necessarily a meaningful quantity. Maybe what we would want instead is economic output per year, something like that, or per person perhaps, or per person per year. Regardless, we have to be very careful about what this aggregator actually ends up being. And we're going to spend a lot of time over the course of the semester thinking about, for this particular variable in this particular situation, what's the right way to combine values in a way that will provide maximum value for the viewer. But anyway, much more on that as time goes on. But for now, hopefully the basics of level of detail and aggregation make sense. In the next phase here, we're going to actually go into Tableau and basically redo this example with live data where we can see how Tableau encodes these ideas. So this purpose of this video is just to get the ideas. But once we go into Tableau, we can see, okay, how does Tableau represent these kind of abstract ideas? Because all of this group by and aggregate, like this, you do the same thing in Python with .groupby.ag. You do the same thing in R. You do the same thing in you do the same thing in SQL. Every programming language, every data science platform has hooks for these ideas. We just need to see how Tableau does it, and that will be our next video coming up.